This is the Get a Life podcast. Ex-Cult Conversations.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Get a Life podcast, Ex-Cult Conversations. We are back here with Richard and Carmen, and our special guest is Mike from infocult.org. We brought Mike on today just for the fact that we had a mutual friend who introduced us, and I was not aware of this website or charity at all. And I thought it was very good that we brought Mike on and let him explain what his charity is all about and its purpose and what we can do to help support it and how we can utilize it. Mike, how are you?
I'm pretty good. I'm just taking the time to actually change my name so that people can see actually my last name, whether they might have an easier or hard time pronouncing it, just so they have a kind of, let's say, our organization tries to be as transparent as possible. So therefore, I'd like to present who I am officially to people.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, if you want to just give our listeners and viewers a little rundown of what the purpose is of InfoSect and your part within it.
I'll start with the second question, which is I'm the founder and executive director, and InfoCult's been around since 1980. And so we've been around for about close to 43 years. It's a center for the assistance and for the study of cultic phenomena. Though principally, I would say a lot of our work is around the area of assistance. The mission of the organization is education to sensitize people to this area and to provide information and study the cultic phenomena in its broadest kind of sense. And most of our work, as I say, tends to be frontline service, which is we tend to receive a lot of calls and inquiries, whether it be emails or phone calls and via other social media, from people who are looking for help and information about this area. And we've been doing this for, like I said, about 43 years. We also house probably one of the largest libraries on this issue in Canada and also in the world. I say that because our collection is multilingual compared to other collections that exist. We work, as I am in Montreal, most of our work is done in French, but we have a large collection, obviously, in English, because most of the material that has come out on this issue is in English, but we have also smaller collections in Spanish and other languages as well. We offer a number of services. Some people might have heard about it, where we run support groups online. We're fortunate in terms of one of our services that we have a number of professionals who volunteer their time to help run the support groups, which we offer in English for former members and in French. And we also right now have a support group for family and friends that runs at present only in French, but we are planning also to start one in English. That kind of, and generally I'd probably say the questions and concerns we get go from A to Z on this area, and about groups literally from A to Z as well. And not just groups, but also, I think, different phenomena. And basically any situation where people feel that they've either been impacted by an experience or someone close to them is going through or has gone through a radical change, and they become worried and concerned and are looking for help.
Are you familiar with the Exclusive Brethren and the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church?
Yeah, I can't say I'm an expert on the group, but definitely have heard about it and have had contact with former members going back a number of years. There are actually some former members here in the Montreal area as well. And when we ran in 2012, we hosted the International Cultic Studies Association annual conference in Montreal in 2012, there were a number of Exclusive Brethren who came and I think wanted to kind of also organize amongst themselves get-togethers as well. So yes, I'm familiar and have had dealings with former members of the organization.
What, in your opinion, what is it like? What are signs to look for that if you're in a cultic group? What would you tell people if they were to call you up and they're, a question? Because a question, comes along. It's like, well, is this a cultic group? Is this a group that maybe is not the best thing for me? What would your answer be or signs to look for?
I'd say one of the primary signs, and I guess I kind of use this kind of like expression You can have a good experience in a so-called bad group and a bad experience in a so-called good group. So the question, what you're looking for, is this group respond to your needs, your interests, your concerns? How do you feel about it? And the difficulty with answering that question as well is that you may have joined or getting involved in the group today, but what happens if the group changes over time? So the ability to always retain a certain kind of sense of questioning and skepticism, I think, is healthy and is not necessarily negative to be able to ask questions and look at how the structure has changed. Because there is a reality that groups, I would say, like people, do change over time. They can change for the better or they can change for the worse. So the thing of being able to retain one's ability to question and say, how do I feel about what's going on? Because maybe many people who are listening to this have gone through it, is like you kind of, at a point sometimes in a group, lose contact with yourself. You kind of doubt yourself. And often I've heard from former members when they leave is they say they were going through kind of a difficult time. They were uncertain, but they couldn't exactly put their finger on it, exactly what it was. It's kind of what happens is kind of that disconnect that goes on between yourself and that kind of your inner voice and what's happening. And so the ability to, I think, kind of listen to oneself and the ability to listen to oneself and not necessarily feel guilty or afraid because of the environment of the group you're in, to do that, I think is important. But to get back, I don't know if there's an easy way to answer that rather than to be able to ask a lot of questions of the group. And like I said, you might, like 10 people can ask the same questions of a group. 9 people can sit there and say, this is fantastic. I love what I found. The 10th can go, sounds like a great group, but not for me. And so is it a cult or not becomes less the question than is the group going to be good for you? And are you going to get something positive out of it?
So would one question be, for someone who thinks they may be in a cultic group, what happens if I vocally, publicly ask questions? In other words, is the group dynamic open to persons questioning the group belief? And if you're afraid to ask a question, that would be a bad sign, I'm guessing.
I think if you're, obviously it depends on the level of involvement you are in the group as well. Because one of the things that I think, and maybe different groups function differently, but in some groups you have different levels of involvement. I mean, I know movements where people will go once a year or just like time once in a while versus those who've really kind of entered into the kind of the center of the organization. So that varies. But those questions, I think, are, as you mentioned, really important. The ability to ask questions and then see how you're responded to. You know, are your questions respected? Are you answered? Are you viewed in a negative way for asking something that might be seen as controversial? I think those are signs of a problematic organization that's not willing to answer questions. That's among other factors, you know, depending what you're looking at. You know, it's like, how much time are you spending in the group? Has the time that you're spending increased since you started? Has some of the beliefs or ideas, and this also depends on the questions you ask when you first got in, have those things changed over time? And why have they changed over time? How do you feel about it? So I guess a lot of the work I do is like encouraging people to raise questions. And I think when you're in a movement where you're devoting a lot of your time, your energy, and maybe resources as well, why can't you ask questions? Why should you be viewed in a negative way about, you know, asking questions? And if the group is really an organization that is beneficial and going to be positive, I don't see why they shouldn't be able to or willing to answer your questions and respect the fact that you might have difficulties. I mean, in certain movements which are a bit more traditional, it's easier sometimes to leave. The question then is it easy to leave the organization you're in? And if it's very difficult for various reasons, why is that the case?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think it's very important that, we're obviously going to refer to the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. I think it's very important that the members that are in there have that capability and know that they have the ability to ask questions, because I think that is a sure tell sign of how it's received of what really is happening inside there. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but it's sometimes, I mean, I guess I look at it because I just recently had, a discussion about a new service for planning. You have some people, and I think that's the case with every organization, that are what they call physically in but mentally out. So, and which relates to the question of exit costs. So people stay in groups, like you're the exclusive brethren, for example, you're married, you have kids. Well, you may think you're wanting to leave, and you know you're not going to ask any questions of authorities because of how that's going to be viewed. What do? You know, if you leave, what is the cost going to be to you? And I think clearly, I think it's important to note that the cost does not necessarily imply financial, but it's emotional, spiritual, social. What are those costs going to be? And so do you have people within the organization who are really, you know, 1 foot out the door, but for various reasons are staying in the group? You know, and so those are issues that come into play. So, but though, if you are somebody who wants to ask questions of authority and leadership, the question always is, how do they respond? But at the same time as knowing sometimes how people feel or believe in groups, the thought of sometimes having a critical question is seen as being totally opposed, against, and almost evil for even thinking of it. And so that if you feel like that when you're in the group about having questions, then you're possibly not at a point where you're going to be expressing too much, unfortunately. But that could change over time. And I think based on your own experiences too, you can probably relate that at certain times, what you keep throwing behind you, the doubts, the questions that you keep throwing behind, get so heavy that at one point there's kind of that breaking point, which kind of was described in the past as snapping, where you just end up saying, no, that's it, it's enough, and you're out. It can be something very small and minor, but it's an accumulation over time. And I think that happens with a lot of people in groups as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest I guess questions that I was having. We have all these people that send us emails, exactly that, 1 foot in and 1 foot out. And it's heart-wrenching listening to them sob on the phone and these heart-wrenching emails. It's just, it is hard. And it is true that there's just those one tiny last thing that when you snap and then you just decide to make that break for it. But I think it is super important that we bring awareness to InfoCult for people, especially members that are inside in our group, the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. How does a current member reach out to you in secrecy? Like, how can do you guys honor confidentiality and secrecy?
Yeah, that's one of the questions we all get most asked at the beginning of conversation. Is it confidential? And yes, I mean, part of it is somebody can call and they don't have to give us their name if they don't want to. I mean, our goal is not to tell you or tell somebody what to do. It's not our role to say, you know, should you leave or should you stay? That's not our goal. Our goal is to help you make, if possible, that kind of choice, cognizant of what the implications are as well, as much as possible, so you're prepared. Because I think sometimes there's an illusion that once you're out, everything's going to be fine and fantastic. The reality, you may physically leave, but that's another process now of having to deal with, okay, your whole experience, what was in, how do you integrate back out into the world at large? And there's each case and each situation is different. And so that's how we function. But people can write us or call us, and it's confidential and don't have to give us much information if they want to chat. And actually, it leads into an interesting project we were just talking about people who are physically in but mentally out, of trying to organize a situation where people can talk anonymously to each other online. So to be able to talk with maybe somebody who's out, with somebody who's still in, maybe have two people who are still in who are questioning, talk to each other as well.
Wow, that is an incredible idea.
So the idea is there now the question of working out the dynamics of how to do it and ensure not just confidentiality, but also to ensure that there's no risks involved for the organization, ourselves, and for those participating in it. But it's it's tough. I mean, I get those kind of calls too from people who are in, and it's like they're married, they got kids, what do they do? And I've also gotten over the years calls from, when we say kids, adolescents who want to leave their families. They want to get out of the group they're in. And these are not easy questions to answer because, it's not like you walk out and all of a sudden everything's going to be rosy.
Yeah.
There's certain practical things that you may not be aware of that is good to know beforehand. In the sense, how do you prepare, if possible?
Mm-hmm.
Now we're talking like kind of in an ideal situation. Most situations tend to be not ideal. People leave, because of different things and then are stuck. But that's why I think it's important to have the ability to be able to contact organizations and resources that exist that can understand what you've gone through and what people have gone through, which is
one need that I think is kind of poorly met at the moment for people wanting to leave is that while, others who've left previously can offer kind of intelligent, emotional support and advice, there's often, particularly with the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, they tie up their members in all manner of legal paperwork, particularly in relation to their businesses. And then often where there's a family breakup, they will hire the very most expensive divorce lawyers and try and retain, for example, the children of marriage within the cult. Do you offer, or do you have any suggestions how people in that situation of exploring how they can leave can get legal advice from a lawyer who may, have some background or understanding of the issues?
Yeah, we have let's say it is one, I guess, of the lack that exists in terms of like an awareness. Our last president of our organization is a lawyer who's handled divorce custody cases and can help a bit with situations like that. There are other lawyers that we have, let's say, contact with in different provinces as well, who have a knowledge of this kind of phenomena. Because it's kind of an understanding that, this is a generalization, that the group, if you leave a closed group and are perceived of as evil, they will go out to protect what they see as the best interest of the children from the member who is still in. So you have to have somebody who understands, since that mindset implies that because you've left, you're evil, there must be something wrong with you. It's clear you have no justification to have rights to your kids. I mean, we've dealt with situations with one woman, not in Plymouth Brethren, but a similar kind of organization, that they put her into a psychiatric institute, and she fortunately got a hold of the lawyer that we deal with and to get her out, because they basically claimed she was, mentally ill. And from their perspective, they may think she was mentally ill because she left, but clinically she wasn't. And that was also an attempt to get control, custody of her child, which fortunately didn't work. But these are situations that, as a lawyer, as another professional, you have to have into consideration that you're not necessarily dealing with, in quotation marks, a normal family conflict. You got the normal family conflict with the group helping behind, or in supporting, which means, unfortunately, sometimes you're going to have witnesses that are going to testify against you, claiming that you're a bad person, evil person, you're alcoholic, you're a drug addict. Actually, just reminds me of another case where the mother claimed there was another group, closed group, that the father was an alcoholic and a pornographer. Turns out he drank a beer once in a while, and he had, I think, Playboy magazine in his bathroom. But from their perspective, from the group's perspective, it was clear the man was an alcoholic because it was totally against what they believed in. So when you have that system, it's knowing the group, knowing where they're coming from, it can help you prepare for those kind of situations when they arrive. A lawyer once told me you can have, and I think it's kind of really pertinent. You can have a good case, you can have a great case. It's not necessarily mean you're going to win. So it's cases like you're bringing up tend to be very complex and costly. And sometimes, it's sad. You win because you have more money. Versus, not that you have, let's say, the truth on your side. And so that's something that I don't know an easy way out. other than to have.
I mean, one thing I'm thinking of is for people who are, I mean, again, talking about the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, the process of leaving is likely to be an extended one. And there's opportunity to do things at a very early stage before the group's aware of your intention to leave that are going to make it a whole lot easier for you from the legal perspective when you finally make that move out. I mean, particularly in relation to business arrangements and financial arrangements, and also in terms of making sure that there isn't any ammunition they can use against you if it does come to a divorce or custody case. I mean, that's something where it'd be really nice to have a kind of a legal checklist. Have I ticked all the boxes in terms of having a really clean legal position when I finally, when the group becomes aware of my intentions and starts to get their own legal team into place?
Well, I think you make a very valid point, which is, preparing ahead. If you're thinking of leaving or preparing, it helps not to, let's say, advertise too much. And at the same time, you're under no obligation necessarily to say, by the way, I'm thinking of leaving. Especially if you're in the group and you know the consequences of expressing that kind of view. It's maybe taking the time, to check out beforehand what are the potential downside to leaving. And so you kind of, like I say, how do you minimize the risks and problems that could arise? I mean, eliminate totally is hard to say, but how do you minimize it? So, and you don't want to get into confrontations or arguments either with people. And so, I don't know if there's so much a checklist, because what happens with checklists is that people are in different situations often. And so they can check off this list, and there are certain things that might not be on that list that applies directly to them. That's why, the same thing when we're dealing with families or people calling, you want to get as much detail as possible, because, every situation, though they may be similar, is different. And, the response to how you deal with it, and the same thing as somebody thinking of leaving and going out, can vary. If you're not married and you're just single, obviously there's less hassles than if you're married with kids and tied in with the business, So
I mean, I think one thing that would be generally applicable is it's very helpful to keep really good records of your interactions with the group leadership, so that you can produce that evidence in court if needed to say, look, I was coercively controlled. Look, they visited me on this day. It was these people. This is what they said. Even if it's just a diary, a properly dated diary, I think that is always helpful at a later date.
Generally, it's always helpful if you're in, and even when you're out, if when you're leaving, to keep a kind of journal, because many people who've gone through the group experience, when they leave, what day was that, what month, what year, because sometimes they all kind of roll into one another, and so it's always a good idea. It's the same way when you leave, often it's a good idea to keep a journal as well, because once you leave, you may be a month or two down the road looking and say, gee, things are still tough. There's no change. I'm just feeling as bad as I did. But when you step back and you read maybe what you wrote, you'll find that there has been incremental changes. It's just that this kind of magical thinking when you're in the group sometimes stays when you're out of it. Whereas I'm out, everything's going to be good from one day to the next. I mean, just the reality is not the case, but there is change that occurs. It just tends to be slower. Over time. So the journal is good to keep in as well as out as well.
And electronic records. I mean, I had the experience leaving the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. I still had the computer they had supplied, because all their members have to get computers from the group, which have got their own software on, which is it's like parental control software, but it also gives them access to your computer. And I hadn't even considered that part of it. And 3 or 4 months after I left and I started publishing a few critical things online, I found that they'd got onto my computer and they'd deleted a whole section of my emails. So it's always good to have if you're keeping records, make sure you have a backup or keep it on a hard drive that you keep in your pocket, because they can be very active in trying to destroy records.
True. I mean, that could be the case. The thing is I think you don't want to have necessarily people always living in a kind of state of paranoia and fear. I mean,
yes,
there's a difference between being paranoid and living always looking over your shoulder and just taking kind of reasonable kind of like steps to ensure that if you're thinking of going, that you're not making it more difficult on yourself down the road.
Yeah. I mean, generally what happens for leavers or people considering leaving from the Plymouth Brethren Church is they get their own phones rather than having a church-issued phone, which is monitored. They get their own phone, and that gives them some independence of communication. That's one of the first steps.
Yeah, but it's, I guess, like saying every situation can be different, because it also depends on your role within the church too, or within any group. Are you on the bottom rung of the ladder, or are you really high up and privy to information and and knowing stuff that's going on within the group that may be perceived as problematic down the road? So how you leave and the impact that will have on the group and how much they may react or not will also depend on that. Because some people, I think there's a reality. Some people in every group, the organization is happy when they leave, because they're troublemakers, in quotation marks. They ask too many questions. They cause too many problems. So those are not necessarily the ones that they're going to be running after to get back, but can demonstrate, see what happens to those troublemakers. They're possessed by evil, and therefore you've lost the grace of God and the protection of God, and now we're doomed to exist in the outside world, blah, blah, blah. So it varies too. I mean, I mention that because it's important to note that people's experiences also within the same group vary, and the impact that it can have on them varies as well. And that can also depend on gender, especially if you don't fit the right gender model that the group espouses too. That can be even more problematic for you while you're in, and also when you're coming out after as well.
Yeah, that's very true.
I guess what I'm trying to say with a number of things where I interject is that there's a certain kind of nuance. And because when people hear the word cult, they assume everybody's in the same group, is at the same level, is being treated, harmed, and experiences the same thing, which is not the case.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah. I want to touch on a subject that I've been very, very curious about. Honestly, it's probably the place where I would put all my time and energy in. It's to do with coercion laws in Canada. What do you think, like, where do you think that could start? How do we start something like that? Do you think Quebec is a place to start it? Or what would be the best province to start something like that? And who would you start it with?
Probably, I guess I would say, probably province of Quebec would be a good place to start, since I guess in terms of exposure around this issue, it tends to generate a lot of media attention, extreme. And a reason I'd say who you approach, I'd probably say based on the previous pre-COVID announcements by the premier here in the province, Legault, I would approach the premier directly. Because previous to COVID, there was stories coming out about groups that were running basically illegal schools and dealing with the issue of children, and his kind of basically astonishment that something like this should happen and be going on in this time, in this time and place in the world. And so I would say approach the premier directly and look at what can be done in terms of, because basically governments, their ability to do something is to make laws. The question with laws, obviously, with any case, is what is the impact and how do you implement it?
Yeah,
it's the same with a lot of things that in the work that we deal with. Is there a willingness on the part of officials to actually implement existing laws when it comes to certain groups? And that's a whole other issue, because I think there's a great reluctance often. It's still, I guess, in a certain mindset, is that when you say religion, people, kind of see that as a hot potato. And a certain kind of assumption, which I think people like to hold on to, which clearly is demonstrated is not necessarily true, is that religion is good. Religion can be good, and religion can be bad and problematic, as I mentioned, within most major mainline religions, the exposure of sexual abuse, etc., exists everywhere. But getting people to move on dealing with situations which, in a sense, go beyond their realm of comprehension. See, that's the big thing, I guess, is do people really understand what's happening and going on? And then looking at, once we do understand, what are the steps or what can we do to alleviate or resolve this kind of an issue? Good, tough question, but I would say get back to it, approach the premier directly. And let him figure out who he should be handling it, because he's the one that expressed great concern and astonishment by the fact that there were a couple of groups in this province that were basically running illegal schools, and almost like a free-for-all when it came to dealing with kids and education.
Wow. Another question. Go ahead, Carmen.
I'm just gonna add something. It's like, laws, I think, can be important, but one should not see that as the be all and end all.
Yeah.
In other words, the law will now take care of this problem and everything is like, we can wipe our hands and say it's finished. It's a step, and should not be viewed as now, once we get this, if we get this into place, that things will all be fine and dandy.
Well, no, and we all know that, laws aren't always implemented when they should be. Yeah, I guess it's just, for me, when I look at spread this all out onto a table, to me, it's like a hole that's missing in the foundation of trying to create a movement of accountability, right? I just feel it's a piece of the pie that's got a hole in it that hasn't been looked at. And I mean, we know in other countries that coercive laws have been brought in, but it's only been on a domestic family situation. It doesn't entail, I don't know anywhere in the world that has a coercive control law on groups.
I don't know if they could do it specifically. I think the thing is, you take laws the same way you have a law against fraud. You don't have a law on fraud dealing with X group or Y group. You have a law on fraud. So the same question is like, if there's coercive control, you take a look at the law, and does the situation with X or Y group apply, then you would use the law. Sexual abuse is not like geared, same thing, or child abuse doesn't have in the law marked that child abuse in groups is child abuse. And so that's why I come back to the question of a willingness to intervene, is to already use existing laws to deal with situations that are there. I mean, a number of cases that are coming up, have come up in the province in terms of fraud, child abuse, sexual abuse, etc., are use existing laws. But it requires sometimes a more inordinate amount of money and resources, because you're not dealing with, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so family situation. You're dealing with, is this a policy of a group? And if this is a policy of the group, how do we find out the information that will support an action, if we're going to take it, against the group or against leadership who have instituted this policy? And you always want to watch out, to me, that you're not going after the member who's the one who has everything in their name, and the leader is basically hiding behind the members, doing things that may be considered illegal, like fraud, etc. Because I know situations where the leader basically doesn't have his name on anything, but it's in the name of certain members. So if there ever came a problem, who's going to get exposed? The member. The leader goes, wasn't me. I mean, so how do you prove that? So it's, that's why I'm saying you need the willingness to understand what's going on in these situations before proceeding, and then looking at how do you apply the existing laws to those situations. And not to say that it is difficult, but it is, and it has been done. There have been cases where you've got youth protection that have taken the time and resources to really build strong cases in groups. At the same time, you've got cases where they've done not so good a job as well.
Yeah. Do you think the Department of Youth Protection offers sufficient protection for children in cults?
Probably the easy way to answer that is yes and no. Because I think it's on an individual case. Like I said, I've dealt with youth protection in certain cases where they've done a really good job and taken the time to investigate. In other situations where no, don't worry about it. We know what we're doing. We know what we're
Yeah.
doing, and it doesn't go anywhere. It varies. I mean, like the system, like much of our system is overwhelmed. We get a fair amount of calls over the course of a year from youth protection workers on certain cases. So there is a willingness to at least step out, find out information about a group, and try to understand more, maybe how to proceed. That's something that we're also looking at, is how to do more training. That's going on a bit more in this province, where certain sorry, I don't even know the word in English now. Those who, kind of the social workers and those who intervene in cases are becoming more trained and better capable of dealing with it. The problem is it's a very high pressure job. That's why you want to train as many people as possible, because, one or two people aware of an issue in an area where they don't stay very long in that job position means there's very little continuity that goes on. So those are factors that we look at when we propose and working on proposing trainings for professionals, is try to get as many people aware. And it's like every area, you can do a certain amount of training information in one day, but you're talking about an issue, like a lot of issues, which you're not going to become really expert or well versed in just one day. And so you need the backup system and that's where it's come up a number of times. This gives you a bit of a sense of my age too. In 1980-81, the Committee for the Youth Protection, after dealing with an investigation into a group which they didn't mention in their report, but it dealt with a group in the Laurentians in Quebec here, said after a number of studies and research dealing with this situation, we find ourselves constantly back at square one. And so what they suggested is the need for more information, more resources, and an interministerial kind of group to get together. Because, you're bringing up the organization you were in. Well, it can touch on many kind of departments, can touch on revenue, can touch on youth protection, can touch on education, and then public policy, just on legal issues as well. And so the issue is you've got each of them working independently rather than coordinating. And that has been one of, I think, the lack, or lacune, they say here, of dealing with some of these groups, because it overlaps into many jurisdictions and they have not been working together. I mean, I've sat around at meetings and it's kind of disheartening, where we've had representatives from different government agencies who can't talk to each other because confidentiality reigns. So even if they're like, sitting around with youth protection, social services, police, and nobody can talk to each other because they're not allowed to. So those are the things that have to be, I think, addressed when you're dealing with the kind of groups that we're dealing with, because they fall into the mandates of different kind of departments, and the need to coordinate would make, I think, moving on situations much more, let's say, practical and easy as well.
So if I'm interpreting you right, the crying need is more for education rather than necessarily changes in the law. The primary problem is people don't understand the concept of cultic coercive control. Is that fair?
Well, part of it, I mean, like, I don't want to put down the suggestion of not instituting laws. The question then, if you're bringing in new laws, who's going to bring them in, and based on what kind of knowledge do they have of the issue that you're trying to formulate a law around? Now, coercive control is a broader one, so it applies, but if you're looking at laws that may apply to specific groups or problems in specific groups, I don't know if you're going to get much headway on it, because I think there would be a reluctance. I think you want to look at situations which can be more broadly applied, whereby if you're dealing with X or Y group and you want to demonstrate coercive control, here's a law that we can potentially use to demonstrate that. But I often get back when I'm asked that question, is like, get people to move on the existing laws.
Yes.
It's like, because I mean, you hear so many stories about basically cash being exchanged in these groups. I mean, you hear this story within a lot of areas. Follow the money is a common theme. Yeah, well, follow the money. Take a look at what's going on. Is there exploitation financially? People being exploited? Is there fraud? People who are getting money, are they reporting it? I mean, it's sad to say that people are more concerned sometimes about cash than individuals, but it's a certain reality. And if the laws exist, why not pursue existing laws? Because, once there is, I think, sometimes pressure put on groups, and on their pocketbooks and how they function, and sometimes when it coming to light in the public light, that can affect the change. It may not be the kind of change one desires, but it can affect the change. But it's a process.
Because coercive control can be hard to prove, but when it comes to forensic accounting, then you can get an extremely solid case. So that's maybe their weakness, is if they've strayed into criminality in that area, it's relatively easy to prove. It's
easier. I mean, it's not to just take away from other approaches, because ultimately the question, I guess, behind all of this is, can you stop some of these groups from operating? And I mean, I think some groups have changed. Sometimes I think groups have stopped because the leader has died. The group has kind of split apart. There's been really public exposure. But for large organizations, the question is, I mean, a colleague of mine once said, if you look, how many groups have, let's say, in quotations, those who fought against them closed down versus how many of those fighters have been closed down? And I think there's been more fighters closed down than there has been groups closed down. Not to say, and this is always the difficult thing, not to say you don't do it, or try to do something, but, are you putting your energy and resources in an area which is going to be practical, or are you going to get the group to circle the wagons and just reinforce even more their conviction and separation from the world? So that's what I'm saying. It's always a question of, I mean, I don't tell people what to do, right? When people call, I say, what is your goal? What do you hope to achieve? What are the pros and cons of the approach you want to use? Because ultimately you're the one who's going to be doing it. You're the one that has to be comfortable with it. But, and if what you've been doing for years hasn't worked, why continue? Is there maybe another way to proceed? So it's not for me to say you shouldn't be doing or trying to close a group down that you feel is doing things that are unwarranted, improper, illegal, harmful. But, question is like, where are your best interests put? And it's something I can't answer. That's an individual.
I think that's a very, very good point. And I think we've long since realized that just closing the group down is unrealistic. What we do feel could happen and is realistic is that they could reform some of their more extreme policies, in particular the shunning and the excommunication, which isn't essential to their existence anyway. I mean, they could function without it. They can carry on without it. And as you say, I mean, particularly the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, they're acutely financially oriented. And if they were to lose their charitable status, or if that was threatened, they would gladly throw quite a lot of their principles out of the window to retain that. I mean, we've already seen them throw a lot of very long-standing principles out for financial gain. So if it came down to it, they had to choose between carrying on with shunning or retaining their charitable status. I've no question the shunning would go out the window. And I think that's a realistic goal.
Possibly. The shunning is a tough one because, first of all, also depends on which country. I mean, a number of groups, let's say, have policy of shunning former members. The question, obviously, from the group internally is, we don't shun. Does this have an impact in terms of people who are former members, posing too much of a risk and a problem for us as an organization? At the same time, and in different, I think there's been different cases around shunning within other groups, and generally that's been considered like, people don't like it, and it's not kind of, let's say, something people would approve of, but in terms of like legally moving in and trying to change a group practices, I don't know if that's something that would work, depending on the jurisdiction you're trying it in. But I think what your point you're making, which is exterior forces or external problems that are brought, let's say, and sometimes public exposure can have an impact. I'll just recount, this is on a smaller scale. There was a smaller group here in Montreal a number of years ago, run by a pastor, a local little church that had about maybe a dozen members. and he was sleeping with a 10-year-old that he basically claimed he had married. And people in the group knew this. This was kind of common knowledge, but they all kind of accepted it because they lived in this kind of closed environment. Once it became public and there was charges against him, even though he tried to defend himself as having married this 10-year-old, everyone except one person left the group because it was kind of confirmation from the outside that they internally felt was wrong was now confirmed by what came out in the media. And so that had the impact of pretty much like closing and stopping the group. So that kind of pressure, depending on the movement, can have an impact in terms of change, as well as the reality is having to adapt to changing times, membership, and then other questions that have come up within other closed groups as well is what's happening to other generations. Are we losing a lot of second, third generation people, like our young people? Are they leaving? Do they no longer want to belong? Those confront the group in other ways, and so, it would be up to people like yourself to figure out, okay, what's the best way to move, to try to affect change. And I guess I would probably say how to do it in the least confrontational way possible, so that you don't get people, up, building walls versus like kind of, let's say, like you were saying, recognizing that maybe it's in our best interest to adapt to changing times. A lot of institutions over time have changed. Why? Yeah. Pressure from inside, pressure from outside that affects change over time. The sad part is some people want immediate change. And in some cases, it's a process. And then it's also a question of when you talk about shunning, in some groups I know, you're supposed to shun, but not everybody really shuns. They just keep contact, but they don't tell anybody you're still keeping contact. So is how do you build within those kind of networks as well, where people cannot, let's say, I can't not talk to my son or daughter even though they left. So you do it on the side, which then indirectly can lead to the person maybe trying to pressure internally, or there may be a number of people going through a similar kind of situation that want to affect the change. They want to stay in the church, but they don't want to see the church the way it is. I mean,
yeah. And I have to say, I've come up across a couple of those are very, very supportive of our movement that we've started. But at the same time, they want to see it become a mainstream Christian church again and not be this cultic association that they're in right now. I do have to say, like, I think one of the ways that we have found that's been very healing and received by both ex-members and people in is by sharing people's stories. And I think, too, obviously people inside there, a lot of it must be very controversial to them, but at the same time, it's really created this huge ripple effect of especially people inside there who have never even really questioned the indoctrination that they were in, to start kind of wake up and realize, wow, this isn't right. This isn't right. And I think that's for us, that is this vehicle that we're driving right now, is having ex-members be able to come on, tell their stories. Obviously it offers some healing to on itself. Right. But this is a marathon. I don't think that this is not going to be something that is going to be done quickly. I think this is something that takes dedication, persistence, being on top of things. I had somebody else who another wise lady who said the same thing that you're saying, is follow the money, go to where, like, that was very much what she had said. Like that's where we need to go to put pressure on, because that is the most easiest fraud to be able to bring up and expose versus all the sexual abuse and horrible abuse that comes through these stories.
But I think I would just underline one of the things you said that I think is important, that if you stick to your own story, you're basically saying, this is what I went through. This is what I experienced. I'm not saying you went through it. So you're not making a generalization. This is what I went through. And people then internally and elsewhere can say, I can relate to that.
Yes.
It's not like I'm being attacked. I'm saying I left for X, Y reason. This is what I experienced. And that, I think, has a much more profound impact than saying, oh, it's a cult, it's dangerous,
Yeah.
you're harming people. I think people that they shut off. Members are just going to shut off. And it's harder to shut off when you're saying, you may be having a great experience.
Yeah.
I didn't. This is what I went through.
Yeah.
And I think people can relate.
And I mean, it's incredible. People who have left like 50 years ago, crying, being able to be, finally, we get to speak about this, let us get it off our chest. And the amount of healing that happens personally for a person is just, honestly, it's one of the most incredible things to watch.
Well, that's one of the things we found also with our support group, because often, and I think you probably have experienced the same thing with your show, is that people often feel, I'm alone.
Yes.
I'm the only one that went through this. This is what we hear very often. And just the fact of being able to speak out and recognize you're not alone. And then with support groups as well, that, it may not even be somebody who was in the same group, but who's gone through something similar to what I went through. I think it became you're saying a very healing experience, as well as kind of like a certain kind of where you just kind of can breathe a bit and say, okay, I'm not crazy. Kind of which is kind of what I've heard also from a lot of former members, because I thought I was crazy because they're telling me I'm crazy for having left and I was a bad person, etc. And so it's very kind of like a great relief, I think, for people to recognize they're not alone and out there.
Yeah. I have another question that someone wanted me to ask you. How do we counter the often used claim by cults that any questioning or intrusion is religious discrimination?
I think part of it is like the position we take is, you're a religion, you claim to be a religion, fine, let's look at what you're doing. The same way I think you have an ability to question and criticize the functioning and actions of any organization. Why is religion immune to being asked questions? I would think that if you're in a more, I would say, kind of respectful religious organization, you would encourage people to ask questions so that their faith and conviction would be even firmer because they're getting the answers. So, that's the kind of a defensive mechanism when I say it's religious persecution. No, I'm asking questions about how you function, what your activities are, how you treat people, the same way I would ask that of any organization, the same way I ask that of the government, So why is this like considered anti-religious? I think that's a kind of a nonsense kind of response, which basically says to me, you're not willing to answer any questions, And what have I asked you that is considered persecuting and opposed to your right to exist? Because our position is very clear. If you're a religion, and you state your religion, you have a right to believe in what you want. You have a right to form around your religious belief. You do not have the right to do what you want. That's another question. And so those are the points that I would make.
Wow. Yeah.
Could you say something about, there's a lot of controversy about the use of the word cult. And of course, that's even more confused when you get to the French, because the words sect and cult interchange between French and English, more or less. Can you just give us a comment on that terminology, please?
There's some people that really like it and are kind of like glued to the term, and that we all know what a cult is. Cult in English is sect with E in French, and people really do screw that up, because sometimes they'll say sect and then they'll say that in English, but a sect in English is not the same thing as the term cult. Sect is more a group that is separated from the main, or splintered off from the main group. As people can find on our website, we don't really do yes or no's. So, because it's a label, and the question ultimately is, when you use that label, what are you hoping to know and find out? What's the question behind it? People often want to know, is X group or Y group a cult? And the question I often, sometimes I learned years ago, is, now you're calling for that. What if I were to tell you the group isn't a cult? Is everything okay now? And you're just going to say, thank you very much, you're going to leave. And people will say, no, because I'm concerned about blah, 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 blah. Let's deal with your concerns. The person in a so-called cult, because often families have already told their parents or relatives, hey, you're in a cult, why do you leave? nobody joins a cult. Cult has taken on such a negative connotation that, what do you think? I'm crazy? No, I'm not in a cult. You don't know what you're talking about. So right off the bat, if you're using that to talk to somebody, you've created a wall which is limiting your communication. And so ultimately, you want to deal with, why do you want to know that, and how is it going to help you? I've gotten cases where people call and say they want to know that, is X group or Y group a cult, because they're in a divorce proceeding. And so they think they can go in front of a judge and say, X group is a cult, give me the kids.
Yeah.
Not going to work, because ultimately it's going to, what are they doing? What's the impact on the kids? So you want to get down to, what are your concerns? The cult label does help for former members, because it kind of puts a framework around one's experience that helps to understand the negative implications of what they went through. But from outside, in terms of, is it a cult, yes or no? Is because the side question, is it a religion, yes or no, or is it a cult? If the group is, like I said before, is incorporated as a religious group, I basically say it's a religious group. What are they doing, and what's the impact? There's a lot of, I guess, labeling that goes on. And I think one has to be very cautious, and though the limitations of that word, especially today. When we first started, we could get into the whole history of our name as well, which is info cult. When we first started, cult had a much more neutral kind of definition. It was like, people who follow a person, belief, or an idea. No negative. And in that period of time, people would sometimes talk about cults and destructive cults to basically indicate these were the harmful groups. But over time, the reality is cult has taken on totally a negative term and becomes almost like a stoppage to talking to somebody. That's why for me, it's like, what do you hope to know, and how is it going to help you? And ultimately, if it is a cult in your mind, how does that change the situation? And if it isn't a cult, how does that change the situation? Because ultimately, you wanted to know is like, is it harmful? That's what people want to know. And it's hard to say yes or no, because you want to know it. Obviously, depending on the group, what we tend to look at is, what is the potential risk? And looking at the structure of the group, is the risk or potential risk higher in this group because of X, Y factors compared to another group, which let's say is maybe open, more tolerant, democratic, respectful, versus a group that's more closed, intolerant, no respect for criticism or other people's opinions, run by a very tight authoritarian structure. Then the more you get to those extreme end, the more potential risk there is for individuals. And depending on the group, is the risk higher for women? If you happen to have a guru or a leader who likes to sleep with the women, or sleep with the kids. So you're looking at all these factors in each group. So it's, where do you place the group on a continuum, for me, is much more helpful than putting all these groups who are a cult in one basket and all these groups who are supposedly not a cult in another, because that's problematic too. Because you have a list, what kind of list? Is it inclusive? So I'm always, like we mentioned on our website, we don't have a list of groups and of cults, and we have no plans or intentions of doing it. And we explain a bit why, but it is an area of controversy. People don't like that our position vis-a-vis that, because for some people, it is very clear what is a cult and what isn't. And
it's not that actually a clear division, it's a spectrum.
That's how we see it, though. And recognizing, I think, if you want that kind of simplistic answers, you're falling into a certain kind of mindset, in my opinion, which is cultic also, which is, now we know what's good, now we know what's bad. Life should be so easy that we can define things like that. Right?
Yes. It might be interesting to actually do the exercise of actually drawing a spectrum and with certain criteria and seeing where different groups fall along that spectrum, because it's sometimes very helpful. I mean, if I'm talking to people about the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, they're small groups, they're not very well known. So then you have to find some comparison. So what I often say to people, well, they're quite similar to Jehovah's Witnesses, but they're more strict in these areas. But they have the same shunning practice and so on. So it's actually helpful rather than just putting them all into a bin to say, well, there's these groups here, they all have similar practices. And then if it's a group that people know of, then that educates them about the group they don't know of.
Yeah. I think it's helpful because that way you get into more precision about discussing certain structures, behaviors, and so that's more helpful in saying they're more closed than, for example, like the Jehovah's Witnesses send their kids to public schools, exclusive brethren don't. So you're looking at, on the continuum, you're putting them a bit more to the extreme necessarily of the Jehovah's Witnesses on certain practices. And Jehovah's Witnesses will talk to people outside the community, will hang out with others who are not members versus, let's say, so that helps to explain more structurally rather than yes, no, good, bad, etc. And I think that would be probably more helpful in giving people a more clear idea or a clearer idea of where, like you're saying, placing this group.
Wow. I also wanted to just share your website just so I can show people where they can help support your cause, because I'm sure you are always in need of donations.
We like I said, any organization needs funds, and just like we do as well.
Exactly.
I would, and for those that are interested, we try to be as transparent as possible. So our annual reports, our financial statements are all.
I saw that.
I think, so we try to, like I say, be as open and upfront as possible, because we're obviously dealing with an issue where we see most groups are kind of closed and not transparent. So we want to be as transparent and open as possible as we can be.
Yeah, and there's an excellent video here for people to watch. Let me just move my little thing here. There's an excellent video. But I really wanted to, so here's the contact information for people. And I wanted to go to the donate. So the donate button is definitely just at the very top here.
Yeah.
And there's different ways of donating. And what do your donations go towards?
Basically, well, like I say, you can see in our financial statement, most of the funds go to, right now, there's myself who's playing full-time, and I have two other people working with me part-time in our operation. And then the rest is like our office, and the rest of the funding goes to pretty much smaller items like phone, electricity, but most of it is just for the staffing of having the organization run. But like I say, people look at the financial reports, they're on site, and because we do get government funding, these have to be kind of reports that we also send into the government. As well as, because we're a charity, this has to go to Revenue Canada as well. It's all like public information. Which is an interesting note. If an organization is a charity, people may be interested to know. If you're in Quebec, organizations that are registered, it's public. You can find out their status by going to the Register des Entreprises. If they're a charity, information on their funding and money that they claim at least publicly to have is public information and is accessible through the Charities Division of Revenue Canada. There's an amazing amount of information if people want to look that is available and is kind of accessible to the public.
Yeah, and we have very much done that with the charities that are inside the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church.
So they see where the money goes to and what your contributions go to.
I mean, we're very concerned recently because the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church had a fundraiser, and it, from the presentation of their fundraiser and the donation forms they put out, it appeared that they were sending the funds to an overseas endowment fund in Australia. And when you look up that endowment fund in Australia, it on their government registration for that endowment fund, it says they're not entitled to issue tax receipts. But yet on the donation form in Canada, it said they'll give you a tax receipt for your donation, which seems very inexplicable.
The Canadian, no, if you donate to a Canadian institution, they will give you the tax receipt. Then they, depending on, I don't know, the legalities, are sending their money to another organization. Charities sometimes do that. The charity in Australia, for example, doesn't have to issue a tax receipt necessarily. But the charity in Canada would probably issue a tax receipt for your donation.
So the question then becomes: is the Canadian charity, are they allowed to send those tax receipted funds overseas to a non-charitable organization? And then the problem is it then becomes a very complicated financial question to unravel all these sort of international network.
But it's a good question. I don't know in terms of the law about charities, but sending money to a non-charitable organization, I don't know. You could ask Revenue Canada, what are the rules and regulations about disbursement of funds that come in and how that works. But I do know that there's a number of charities that raise money for causes outside the country. So, but in terms of the legality of anything, that's beyond me.
Yeah. We really need a charity expert to help in that kind of following the money trail, because when it gets to international, financial transfers, it's complicated to follow. So if
there's anyone out there listening that can help us on this, we would welcome your expertise.
That's an area like with the same thing is that when you hear about offshore tax shelters and money diverted to this company then diverts it to others, I don't know, you really, like you're saying, need somebody who really knows the ins and outs of how that works.
Well, Mike, I really, really appreciate you coming on. I think this was a very much needed podcast. And I'm just in awe over your knowledge, and it helps me change some perspectives I've had, and kind of where my arrow has been pointed might get changed into a different direction. It was very informative.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the invitation.
And Mike, you've been dedicated to this work for what, 40 years or more now?
That's a whole other story of explaining. I mean, shortly, I got involved in this in the 70s because of a close friend's experience in Unification Church. Make a very long story short, the experiences we had, and it's a story in itself, we ended up kidnapping, deprogramming. This is epic 1970s, 80s kind of story of kidnapping, deprogramming our friend out of it. And another friend of ours, for Canadians who may know him, Josh Freed, who's a journalist and a friend, wrote up the series of articles on our experience, which is subsequently published into a book and an award-winning film called Ticket to Heaven, which is all still available online.
Wow.
That generated a lot of publicity, which got me interested in other people at the time to try to put something together. Like I said, long story in probably less than a minute, which took up a whole book when it was written by the journalist.
Well, we'd really love to just thank you for your dedication, because I'm sure you've helped countless numbers of people and you've made an awful lot of lives better in the course of your career. So more power to your elbow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for, go ahead.
I was just going to say, feel free if somebody wants to contact me or contact us. The information on our website, how to reach us, is there. Don't hesitate.
And
it may take a day or two.
I'll attach a link to the website in the description underneath this podcast, and I'll also attach the link for donations to help support InfoCult.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining us today. Much love to you all.
To share your story or be a guest on the show, email info.getalife@proton.me.